Pickway, Kansas, October 4th, 1895, a Friday. A husband and wife traveling with a vaudeville roadshow welcome to the world a baby son. They named him Joseph Frank Keaton. Born into a life of show business, little Joe officially joined the act with his parents Joe and Myra in Wilmington, Delaware on Wednesday, October 17, 1900. He had just turned 5. Making it to 5 was a feat in and of itself. Keaton family lore says that the toddler lost his first joint of his right forefinger in a clothes wringer accident, and if you watch his films close enough, you can see where it's missing. He also got hit in the face with a brick he threw that rebounded off the tree, and then there's the story of the cyclone that sucked him out a window and dropped him a few blocks over unhurt. But the most famous story of all is how little Joe became Buster. The legend is that he took a tumble down a flight of stairs when he was around 18 months old. After hitting the landing, his godfather and family friend, who also had an act with the show, scooped the tyke up and said, "What a real Buster!" And with that, Joseph became Buster. All thanks to Harry Houdini. Buster was an entertainer, a comedian, yes, but he was also a song and dance man. Showbiz was in his blood. Growing up on the road with the shows, Buster would watch and talk to the best and extract information that would come in handy on down the line. He learned through audience reactions that if he didn't smile during the act, he got more laughs. That's when he started to develop the deadpan look, or the great stone face, that became his signature and trademark. That's about all the education that Buster received and, as it turned out, needed. With what was billed as the roughest act ever on stage, the Keatons had to prove time and time again that Buster was not being abused and that it was all a professional act. The Jerry Society and local police in several towns would keep a keen eye on them, watching every move they made. Buster himself would have to prove to the authorities that he was not abused or in danger. As rough and physical as the act was, there are only 2 known incidents of injury in the 17 years Buster performed on stage. But the worst injury for Keaton in those roadshow days actually came from a train wreck where he broke his leg. He was back at work within a week. After leaving the act in 1917, Buster appeared on Broadway, but it wasn't long before he left the live stage altogether. A couple of months after signing on with Schubert's passing show of 1917, he met Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. Arbuckle cast Buster in his first film, The Butcher Boy, that was shot the next day, and Keaton nailed his part without any retakes. Buster was hooked, and after just 3 films, Arbuckle made him assistant director, and he also went on to be Fatty's sole writer. War was raging in Europe and had been since July of 1914. The U.S. got involved in 1917, sending troops overseas. 22-year-old Buster was drafted into the Army and assigned to Company C, 159th Infantry, 40th Division, American Expeditionary Forces. Corporal Keaton would joke later about his career at the rear, never seeing combat. He did, however, suffer from hearing loss in one ear, which became permanent due to the cold and damp conditions. Following the war, Keaton picked up where he left off with Arbuckle. He continued making films with Fatty until 1923, when he was given his own production studio and team by studio head Joseph M. Schenck. Buster's first movie with his new unit was a parody of D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. It was also the first feature that he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in. The Three Ages was a hit. Movie-wise, the 1920s were good for Buster. He came out with what most of his peers in the industry, as well as the public, said was his best work, though not at first. The General was a true story from the Civil War, released in January of 1927. It may now be considered his masterpiece and dubbed as one of the greatest films of all time, but the movie was not a hit with the critics. It seemed his genius was ahead of its time. Off-screen, Buster's home life was not as grand. In 1920, he married Natalie Talmadge, an actress he had worked with a couple of times. The marriage was a tumultuous one that produced 2 boys for the couple, but even that couldn't save them from divorce. Keaton would marry 2 more times. May Scriven was number 2 for a short period, and his third and final marriage was with Eleanor Norris from 1940 until his death. They were married 25 years before Buster passed away. The stories about Buster never being injured shooting a film are false. He was hurt a few times. His recorded injuries are few, but they were very real and serious. A crushed foot, a broken nose. He was knocked unconscious by a cannon once during the production of The General. But the scariest one of all came in Sherlock Jr. The scene had Keaton running on top of a train, grabbing the spout from the water tank the train was passing. While still holding on, the spout lowered to drop the water as planned. The power of the water was so forceful that it knocked Buster down to the tracks where he hit his neck against the rail. He got up and completed the scene, running away from his pursuers. It was a few years later when he found out he broke his neck. The General, released in 1927, will turn out to be maybe Buster's best work. Some have said and still say it's his masterpiece. The movie was based on a true story out of the Civil War, also starring Marion Mack. But the critics weren't so nice to Keaton or the film. It has since been celebrated as one of the greatest comedies of all time. Some say the greatest movie ever made. It seemed as if Buster was ahead of his time. In 1928, Buster made what he called the worst business decision he ever made. Schenck talked Keaton into signing with MGM, and in spite of the warnings from his friends like Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, Buster made the move anyway. He made several movies for MGM, but none were as good as his earlier films. MGM had a formula that had to be adhered to. Cutting out innovation, improvisation, and creativity is what Buster said. The studio knew how to make movies, successfully, but they didn't know comedy. The quality of Buster's pictures were diminished, and it was noticeable, not just behind the scenes, but on screen as well. The worst years for Buster was in the early 1930s. He started drinking a few years earlier, and it affected his work and his home life. His marriage to Natalie Talmadge was rocky and ended in divorce in 1932, with his drinking being one of the culprits. The death of his close friend Fatty Arbuckle at the age of 46 from an apparent heart attack didn't help his psyche either. And, to pile on, the IRS was hounding him for thousands in back taxes. Then, he was fired from MGM. Buster Keaton was in a fight for his life. The alcohol took control. In 1934, Keaton was admitted to a sanitarium where they put him in a straitjacket, trying to cure him from the disease, but not of his own free will. His childhood memories came back to him. Houdini had taught Buster how to escape a straitjacket, and that is exactly what he did. He knew what alcoholism looked like. His father was the perfect example. He didn't want to go down that path, and with his stubborn determination, he didn't. Through all of this, Buster still found a way to support his family, the entire family, his mother, father, siblings, and their families as well. At the end of 1934, Keaton, unlike others that may have fallen from grace in Hollywood, seemed to always find work. Not slacking off, Buster had steady gigs throughout the 30s and 40s. He would put product out for educational pictures, Columbia, and a few independents too. He also took advantage of his international appeal. He shot at a few locations throughout Europe, including France, a nation of people who still love Buster today. He was married for the third time in 1938 to Eleanor Norris, a contract dancer for MGM who was 23 years younger. They remained a couple for 26 years. Only his death separated them. Keaton continued working through the 1950s and 60s, but it was not all in film. He appeared in television as well as on stage. Buster toured Europe again with a couple of shows, and in 1960 toured the U.S. with Dodie Goodman in the Broadway hit Once Upon a Mattress. Keaton also showed up in several movies, some of the more popular films of the time, like It's a Mad, 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 Mad World or Around the World in 80 Days. Buster also appeared in a couple of the beach movies that were all the rage in the 1960s. Buster's final role for Hollywood was in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and was released 9 months after he died. The Great Stoneface, Joseph Francis Buster Keaton was 70 years old when he died of lung cancer, February 1st, 1966.